Welcome to Học Tiếng Anh với Joseph, where we build vocabulary and practice pronunciation through reading. Continuing with The Cat in the Box, a history of science in 100 experiments. Today we will read story number 60, A Pavlovian Response. The work for which Ivan Pavlov became famous provides a classic example of a discovery being made by a combination of luck and a scientific approach to observation and experiment. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who was interested in the mechanism of digestion. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, he was studying how this worked in dogs. He had doubts about the value of the then new studies of psychiatry and psychology, but by chance he made his name through experiments in psychology. As part of his study of digestion, Pavlov and his assistant Ivan Tolochinov were carrying out experiments on dogs. Using delicate surgical techniques, the digestive juices and products of the salivary glands were diverted so that some of these secretions could be collected outside the bodies of the dogs without otherwise affecting the animals. The point was to carry out the studies on living animals, going about their more or less natural, normal lives, instead of relying on dissections of dead animals or invasive surgical procedures on living but immobilized animals who subsequently died. As Pavlov put it, it is perfectly clear that successful study of the digestive process, as of any other function of the organism, depends to a considerable degree on whether we succeed in finding the nearest and most convenient point of view on the process under observation, and in removing all intervening processes between the phenomena under observation and the observer. Pavlov was extremely proud of the care taken to ensure that the animals were pain-free and well looked after. He went on, "Our healthy and happy animals did their laboratory work with real gusto. They always eagerly moved from their cages to the laboratory and readily jumped onto the tables where our experiments and observations were conducted. This made it possible to measure the flow of digestive juices under different conditions and according to what food the dogs were fed. It was no surprise to find that the dogs salivated at the sight of the food, but the food was always brought to them by the same technician, and Tolochinov noticed that after a time the dogs salivated whenever they saw the technician, even if they were not being fed. Intrigued, Pavlov organized a series of experiments in which different kinds of stimulus, such as bells and buzzers, flashing lights and ticking metronomes, were presented to the dogs at the time the food was offered. In a classic example, he rang a bell just before giving the dogs their food. Soon, the dogs began to salivate every time the bell was rung, even when no food was offered. He called this a conditional response. The term was later modified to conditioned response, and found that the response was stronger if the food had been served more quickly after the bell was rung during the initial conditioning. But when he stopped serving food at the time the bell was rung, the conditioned reflex, now sometimes called a Pavlovian response, wore off, and the dog stopped salivating at the sound of the bell. Pavlov called the bell a conditional stimulus, because the dogs were conditioned to respond to it, by contrast with food, which was an unconditional stimulus producing an unconditional response. Tolochinov described the experiments at a scientific meeting in Helsinki in 1903, and Pavlov presented them to a meeting in Madrid later that same year. As news of the discovery spread, it had a big influence on the way people thought about themselves, as it was realized that people could be conditioned by experience to respond in certain way to specific stimuli. Aldous Huxley presented a dystopian view of the implications of this in his 1932 novel Brave New World. Later experiments showed that conditioned reflexes originate in the cerebral cortex. They are literally learned and stimulated further research into the way the brain works. Although Pavlov received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1904, it was too soon for the importance of his work on conditioning to be recognized, so the award was given in recognition of his work on the physiology of digestion. To the vocabulary section, physiology, physiologist, mechanism of digestion, mechanism of digestion, doubts, doubts, I have doubts, psychiatry and psychology, psychiatry, psychology, salivary gland, saliva, saliva, salivate, salivary gland, secretions, secretions, invasive surgical procedures, invasive surgical procedures, immobilized, immobilized, intervening processes, intervening processes, pain-free, well looked after, pain-free, well looked after, gusto, gusto, intrigued, intrigued, stimulus, stimuli, stimulate, stimulus, stimuli, stimulate. Stimulate is a noun, a verb, Conditioned response, conditioned response, conditioned reflex. Wore off, a past for wear off. Wear, wore. Worn, worn off. Dystopian view, dystopian view. Cerebrocortex, cerebrocortex. Thank you for your attention. As usual, I will see you in the next story. Bye-bye for now.